Before I begin this morning's sermon, I want you to remember the name Jocelynn Rojo Carranza, an American citizen living in Gainsville, Texas. She was an 11-year-old student harassed by white students who taunted her that they would report her family to immigration and have them deported. Despondent, this young child of God, took her own life earlier this month. How is it that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren have been taught that harassment of others is not only okay, but encouraged? And that leads me to today's lesson. Jesus has already asked his followers to love their neighbors. And that was tough enough. After all, haven't most of us had neighbors that we wish would move away or simply disappear? Whose dogs bark nonstop at 3 o'clock in the morning? That neglect their lawn until it's knee-deep in weeds? Or refuse to kill the dandelion crop that has spread to everyone in the neighborhood? But now Jesus is asking his followers to love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. It's one of the most challenging yet transformative teachings in all of Scriptures. The words are not easy, but they can be life-changing. And let's be honest, it's uncomfortable. It runs against everything that we've learned about self-preservation, fairness, and justice. But that is exactly what makes it so powerful. As I look at today's topsy-turvy world, everything seems to be rooted in retribution. And it really doesn't matter whether the grievance is true or merely perceived, because whenever we seek retribution, whenever we want payback, we are working for evil. And Jesus is not just talking about what we say, but how we put our words into action. It's about breaking the cycle of hatred and retaliation. Jesus knows when we meet hatred with hatred, it only perpetuates pain and division. But when we respond with love, we introduce God's transforming power into the equation. Imagine what our world would look like if we actually practiced this. What if instead of holding grudges, we sought reconciliation? What if instead of seeking revenge, we prayed for those who hurt us? What if instead of demonizing those who are different from us, that we extend kindness? Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. Definitely not what first century Jews were thinking about their Roman rulers. Even today, these words challenge us to respond in a way that disrupts the cycle of violence. Offering the other cheek or giving freely of what we have is an act of defiance against the norms of power and retribution, saying, I will not be ruled by anger, fear, or greed. I will be ruled by love. As John Lennon wrote, give love a chance. Our Old Testament lesson today is a great example. It would have been easy for Joseph to retaliate against his brothers who left him to die in a well. And when Joseph announces who he is to his brothers, that is exactly what they were thinking. They feared for their lives. Yet Joseph does exactly the opposite of what they expected. He loved them, and he saved them and their people from starvation. Jesus' love is all about the posture of our hearts. He calls us to live with openness, trusting in God's abundance. When we give freely, we reflect the very heart of God, who gives generously to all without recompense. And Jesus goes on, but love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. For God's mercy and love is not just reserved for the deserving or the righteous. It is poured out for all, for you and for me. We've been forgiven much, so we are called to forgive much. We have been loved generously, and so we are called to love generously. Jesus reminds us that the way to treat others reflects on a relationship with God. When we judge or condemn others, we place ourselves in the role of the Almighty, a role that we were never meant to fill. But when we forgive and extend mercy, we align ourselves with the value of God's kingdom. This doesn't mean that justice isn't important. It is. But as followers of Jesus, we are called to approach justice with humility, always seeking reconciliation and restoration. But the love that Jesus calls us to is not easy. It's the kind of love that changes hearts, reconciles relationships, and transforms the world. In these days of chaos and uncertainty, it's essential that we take control of our own lives. We can't let someone else or something else determine it for us. So let us ask ourselves, how can we step closer to living out God's radical love in our own lives? How can we reflect the mercy of God to those around us, even when it's difficult? Amen.